the newsagents.
Today, we send a message to Keir Starmer and his government. This country has been failed by governments of all political persuasions. Our expectation is your government will break old habits and implement all the recommendations made by Sir Martin Morbick's report without further delay, because the time to address this is already 3 decades too late. For the report to be worth anything...
That was Natasha Elcock. She's the chair of Grenfell United, a residents group, a supporters group who have been fighting hard to understand what went wrong at Grenfell Tower on that fateful night 7 years ago, the 14th of June, when more than 70 people were killed in a fire in the 21st century in Britain.
The Grenfell inquiry has taken years to reach its conclusions, but today we have its final report. And those conclusions, what it says, is searing. It is searing in every direction for governments over decades, for the companies who provided the cladding, for the council, for the groups that were supposed to run this tower block and ensure its residents' safety. 7 years on, what have we learned? And isn't the truth that actually this could all happen again? Welcome to the newsagents.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And the reading of this report, 1,694 pages long, is both grim and in some ways unsurprising. What we learnt, what we had confirmed, is that the deaths were all avoidable. If things had been done differently, if it hadn't been, as the chair of the inquiry, Sir Martin Morbick, says, for dishonesty and greed in some cases, he's talking about corporate construction greed as well, then those people could still be alive today.
There is almost no public body or indeed private body which had any dealings with Grenfell Tower and other blocks like it that are spared criticism, the harshest criticism. To deal with the government first, which in a way Sir Martin Morbick finds are obviously central to this. Morbick says that the housing department, under many governments, failed to heed warnings about the serious risk to life posed by cladding systems. He says that they were indeed well aware of the potential danger and yet did nothing about it. His report said the department, which it called complacent, poorly run and defensive, had presided over a woefully deficient and fragmented regulatory regime, and that it failed completely those who were living in Grenfell and indeed other towers.
Yeah, and he also points the finger at what he calls unscrupulous building companies, the people who made that combustible cladding. Cladding being the material that goes on the outside of the buildings that contributed to the spread of the fire. It was foam insulation wrapped around Grenfell. And he says that there were people engaged in the deliberate manipulation and dishonesty to push products they knew would not have passed the safety tests onto that tower. That is the greed of which he's talking.
Yeah, and this is the theme that you see again and again. Whether it's a public organisation, body, or a private one, you see basically the report outlines indifference and incompetence or fecklessness, despite the fact that repeatedly warnings were made or people complained within the tower about safety standards. Nothing was done again and again. Looking at another organisation, Kensington Council, which is the local council. The report criticises them and indeed the organisation which was responsible for fire safety as repeatedly failing in their duty of care to listen to and heed the concerns that residents of the tower had. So this is, again, you just see it. And as you said, Emily, in a way, we might have known this, but to see it laid out so starkly reminds us just what a crucial asymmetry of power there was between the people in that tower who actually really liked their homes, really loved their homes, but wanted their homes to be properly looked after, either by central government, local government, or the companies involved, but were just ignored because they didn't have any power to prosecute what they wanted to happen.
You and I were both working at Newsnight on the night of the fire, and I remember starkly, clearly covering the fire when the flames were still blazing, and we were on at 10:30 at night, and the very top of the building was still alight. The first we heard of it, and I was a resident from close by was about 1 a.m. The sirens started, and I remember sort of turning to my husband saying, "Oh my God, what's that?" And he looked at his phone and he went, "Oh no, I think it's okay. I think it's just a fire." It was the sense that it wasn't terrorism. And I remember thinking, okay, fine, a fire in 21st century Britain doesn't kill anyone, right? We can go back to sleep. And it was only when I went for a morning run, a few hours later, went up to Primrose Hill and looked back that I saw this huge, dense cloud of black smoke. And I thought, a fire that can travel across London, a fire that can be seen from Ladbroke Grove, from North Kensington all the way into Marylebone, is not a fire that is no problem. And sure enough, this was the story of the night, the story that we then covered. And on Newsnight that night, I remember speaking to one of the residents who was telling me that she had been campaigning the government and local government about the questions, the issues that they had then. And I remember this very odd moment, which was in my ear, the sort of producer, the editor was saying, "Oh, make sure you try and give both sides, or make sure you cover the other side, or make sure you say they're not here to represent yourself." And I remember just thinking, I can't. This is a resident who's telling me that warnings were ignored. She's telling me of all the times, she can cite all the times when they raised these concerns and warnings were ignored. And I'm standing in front of a building that is still on fire. I'm actually not going to shut her up. And it's that, I think, that really kind of gets to the heart of this report, that for the residents, this was not news. They knew about this before the fire happened. They had been trying to raise the alarm before it happened. And now the rest of the world is catching up with it.
Well, indeed, and to be absolutely specific, the report exactly articulates what that woman was telling you.
Yeah.
Because Morbick says that the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea showed, quote, persistent indifference to fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people, and said that the tenant management organisation, which managed the building, quotes, as an uncaring and bullying overlord that belittled and marginalised its residents. And indeed that the then chief executive, a man called Robert Black, showed an entrenched reluctance to even inform the council about any concerns or matters that affected fire safety. So again, you just see in organisation after organisation something that you actually, I went on to report quite a lot about different similar sort of stories in different places. Just a complete kind of indifference, just a complete computer says no attitude to
It'll
anyone.
Be fine. It'll be all
fine.
right.
Don't worry about it. Even after Grenfell happened, and this is still happening, we can talk about it. But that, I think, again, that asymmetry of power was just so profound, and we saw what happened. It led to the most tragic, catastrophic consequences.
Well, let's listen now to the chair of the inquiry, Martin Morbick, speaking earlier.
It was necessary for us to investigate in as much detail as the evidence would allow the circumstances surrounding the deaths of those who perished in the fire. The report we're publishing today contains our findings on all these and other matters. However, the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants.
We are so used to hearing reports kind of called whitewashers. Oh, he pulled his punches, he didn't really spell it out, he didn't really say what could have changed. This one feels very different because Martin Morbick, who you just heard there, singled out actual companies, and he singled out Arconic, Celotex, Kingspan, and accused them of engaging in what he called deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing process, misrepresent test data, and mislead the market. And he says that for nearly 20 years, or since 2005, Arconic had possessed data showing that its cladding product was, when bent into a box, reacted to fire in a very dangerous way. So imagine this company now hearing the chair of the inquiry say, "You have known about this since 2005. Can they survive this? Should they survive this? Or will there be prosecutions as a result?"
And I think we have to cast our minds back as well to the sort of what that week was like, because politicians come in for excoriating criticism in this report of all parties, but obviously by the time you get to 2017, when the catastrophe happens, the then Conservative or coalition government had been in office for 7 years. And obviously it happened, easy to forget this now, but literally in the week of, or rather the sort of 7 days after, the general election of 2017. I remember that for all of the human horror of it, there was an element of genuine political peril to it as well. It felt like a really weird political week, because obviously what had happened is Theresa May had obviously had the election. She completely unexpectedly lost her majority. She looked like such a vulnerable political figure, and less than a week later she was having to respond to one of the most profound domestic tragedies that has taken place in this country for decades. And you could see, obviously, she came under for criticism in terms of how she responded at the time. The report also says that her government's immediate response was confused and haphazard and not what it should have been. But it added to that it was a bizarre summer, with a really odd political atmosphere, and it added to it. And of course, you interviewed Theresa May that week.
It was an absolutely awful campaign. It was an awful summer of tragedy. That was the year 2017 where, on the morning that I had been due to follow Theresa May to Torquay on the campaign, we suddenly got all diverted to Manchester. It was the Manchester Arena bombing. That had been in the middle of the campaign. We'd had the terrorism attacks at London Bridge. We'd had the terrorism attacks in Westminster.
This was all within
it all happened within sort of
so.
3 or 4 months, I think it was. And it created a sort of a sense of I think political exhaustion. I remember as journalists, and we're not the ones that matter. There were real, victims in all of this. But I think the journalist class had this sense of trepidation every single day. Something terrible happened, or
profound
something.
Uncertainty.
It was really, really unsettling. And at the end of this campaign, as you said, she lost her majority. Jeremy Corbyn had made big gains but didn't succeed as Prime Minister, and she was then hunting for coalition partners. Do you remember she ended up using the DUP?
Well,
she had to go to Northern Ireland to actually find a way of making her party the majority in Parliament.
And she had gone so quickly from being such a titanic figure of undisputed authority to being someone who looked feeble and weak and without authority.
She looked spent. And she had these advisors at her side, Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, who after that election had basically been dismissed. They hadn't done her proper as advisors. They hadn't managed to win her the majority. And so they were sort of dispatched, and there were other people who kind of said, they've done you no favours. And so at the time of Grenfell, she looked alone. That was the thing I remember most clearly. And I was on Newsnight covering the Grenfell story on the Friday, and Theresa May had tried to go down to pay her respects to the firefighters and the victims of the tragedy at Grenfell, and she had got booed. And at that point she'd said, I don't feel able to do an interview down at Grenfell Tower. I'll come back to Television Centre. It's very, very unusual. Except for the Sunday morning shows, it's very, very unusual to have
she was criticised for not talking to the
She was criticised for not talking to the victims because I think she talked first to the firefighters. And so she diverted the car and came to Broadcasting House. And my editor at the time, Ian Katz, said, Emily, I'll do the interview. She wanted to come in and just explain that a fund had been set up, that they were going to give victims relief, and she'd put some money into this fund. And
this was the only interview she was doing, wasn't it?
It's the only interview she'd done. And she sat down with Newsnight in this room on the ground floor, because she didn't even want to come up to the studio. And we had this incredibly intense exchange. And I think it was intense. I look back to that time, and I think it was intense because it was one of the first time, maybe the only times, that I had seen a tragedy unfold in my own neighbourhood. I knew a lot of the people involved. I'd been volunteering on the ground. I had been part of the sort of, the taxi running service that was taking sort of survivors to, moving them out of their homes and trying to find them places to stay or work out where their next meal was coming from. I've been sorting through the clothing and all that sort of stuff. And so when Theresa May sat down with me, and I say this with a sense of slight guilt, actually, I'd slightly morphed from being a journalist into being somebody who was, who was sort of passing on. Well, who was invested. I was passing on in my questions, the questions that the survivors were asking me. Where do we get our next meal? When are we going to move home? Why didn't they do anything before this? Why did they ignore all the stuff? What was going on with the cladding? And so I asked Theresa May the stuff that they had put to me. And she sounds, and you can hear her voice crack, I think, in the clip we'll play, she sounds shattered.
We have yet to find out what the cause of the fire was. The fire brigade, the fire service are doing that.
You could have stopped it spreading by spending £2 more on the cladding.
The fire service are looking at what the cause of the fire was. And it's important that we get to the bottom of this, that we find out exactly what happened.
But you were recommended this in 2013. You were in government there, and a coroner said you can stop this with a sprinkler system in every block.
And the government has taken action on the recommendations of the coroner's report. But what we need to do in relation to this incident, to this horrifying fire, is to make sure that we get to the bottom of why this fire took place, what happened, why did it spread so unexpectedly and so ferociously and so quickly.
But we know that Gavin Barwell sat on a report.
We now know what we didn't know then, because we have this report, which is to say that those questions about what happened in 2013 were exactly right, because it is something that Martin Morbick talks about in this report. He cites the fact that the then Communities Secretary, Eric Pickles, failed to act on the 2013 recommendation to tighten up fire safety regulations after a similar cladding fire at a place called Lakanal House, another London council block, where it killed 6 people. Morbick says it was not, quote, treated with any sense of urgency, and indeed criticises more widely, and I think this is quite interesting for current politics, criticises more widely you remember, Emily, the thing that David Cameron talked about in the early part of his government, the bonfire of regulation, this idea that, you'd have one regulation in and one regulation out, and that was the government rule. And Eric Pickles in particular, who comes out pretty badly in this report, Pickles in particular sort of took to that with aplomb, and he really wanted to kind of drive it through the Department of Communities and Local Government. It's a reminder that, regulation cannot be viewed in that way. If something needs to be regulated, then it needs to be regulated, not that somehow that negates some other regulation elsewhere. The key is to have good regulation, and you wouldn't know that necessarily, and properly enforced, and you wouldn't know that necessarily even from the way we talk about it in our current politics, or even in the current Tory leadership campaign. I was watching James Cleverly's speech the other day, a politician who I think it has a lot to say in some ways, but he was talking about that bonfire of regulation then, and saying actually we need to step it up. That actually, I can't remember what he said, but actually we need 2 regulations out for everyone in, or 3. And this is the most sort of facile way of seeing regulation. If we have learned nothing from Grenfell, it is to think that somehow regulation in and of itself is bad. You can have bad regulation, and we should get rid of it, but it's not an inherent problem. Indeed, far from it.
It's a bit like the way people treat health and safety as a parodic phrase. Like, health and safety means, nobody's allowed a Christmas tree at Christmas. It doesn't actually. Health and safety is probably what previous tragedies have decreed could stop future tragedies. And yet we've sort of had this response to anything health and safety as being sort of, that's not much fun. That's not going to help Britain grow. When actually you look at what this has meant in real terms, which is people ignoring things that they knew about, people ignoring things that would have cost pennies more to make better, and not doing anything about it. And I mean, Theresa May says there, doesn't she? We will get to the bottom of it. That was 7 years ago. We've had 4 prime ministers since then. We had a fire last month in Dagenham. We've got a fire going on now as we speak in another high-rise block. So you do have to kind of say, at what point does the priority of things that people actually warned about become too big to ignore?
Well, the problem is, because it was ignored for so long, and because so many of these companies were allowed to, and councils were allowed to install things they never should have done, the problem has become more expensive than it would have been if we dealt with it in the first place, if we'd had better regulation in the first place and spent, as you were putting to May, slightly more money then. Because guess what? Once you build a building, it's really much more difficult, more expensive to retrofit it or solve it after construction than it is when it's up. And we should remember, you talk about the 7 years. I mean, the thing that these families really want, of course, is justice. They want to see people imprisoned. They want to see people in court. And the texts from the Met today are saying that they will now need to spend another 12 to 18 months poring over the findings, quotes, line by line, before possible charges. And those charges could include corporate manslaughter, gross negligence manslaughter, fraud, perverting the course of justice, misconduct in public office. But the Crown Prosecution Service say that will happen at the very earliest in 2027, and then obviously much later to trial. So we're probably looking at in terms of from when this fire started, assuming there are any prosecutions or convictions, we're probably talking about at least a decade, if not longer.
Look, after Grenfell happened, your work on Newsnight took you into the modern buildings that were still being covered with cladding after this had all happened, and the expense that would have taken to get rid of it, and the fact that young people were buying flats that they couldn't even insure. They couldn't sell, they couldn't improve, and they couldn't insure. They were absolutely stuck in a place where bad building regulations, as you say, bad regulations was making their own lives hell all over again.
And we'll talk about that just after this. So as Emily was saying before the break there, this story, I mean, there's enough to sort of digest and think about and talk about with Grenfell itself and the tragedy there. But of course, it ended up spawning so many other stories because Grenfell itself had a profound effect on Britain and British housing in two ways. One, obviously, they then became aware very quickly, or people started to worry very quickly, about the same cladding that had been used on Grenfell or similar type products being used on other tower blocks. Yeah. And obviously lots of people rightly and totally understandably concerned about it, not wanting to live there, wanting to see remediation. That itself has taken many years. We learned that the government actually, again, the sort of shocking failure of kind of regulation and local government, often didn't even know which buildings had these materials on them, so had to do all these complicated assessments, and that took years and cost loads of money. That process is still ongoing. In a sense, some of these buildings still have that cladding. It's cost billions to try and remediate. But then there was this other effect which sort of unfolded in the years since, and I covered quite a lot on Newsnight, which was about building safety in general, which is that new builds, and I'm talking, for the last 20 years or so, often leasehold flats in cities, suddenly found, or there was a concern that some of the materials and the way that they had been constructed were dangerous, particularly with regards to fire safety. And that whether it was the type of insulation that had been used within the buildings, or whether there were appropriate fire safety remediation, whether it was the cladding, whether it was the materials used, there was a whole suite of things. And the government found itself having to make assessments, and freeholders having to make assessments about whether these buildings were actually safe. And what we basically discovered, and what we were reporting on at Newsnight at the time a lot, was that in many, many cases, the actual quality of the materials being used in buildings like being built, I'm talking in like 2020 or 2021 or 2022, were simply not of a standard that many people would consider to be truly fire safe. And as a result, what you found was literally potentially millions of people living in buildings that either were considered not truly fire safe, and that is worrying in and of itself, but also potentially, well, not even potentially, actually unmortgageable, unsellable, because banks would not cover or would not be willing to actually cover mortgages on these properties because they were afraid that they would end up in smoke. Whether that was right or wrong, that was the impression. So government ended up, basically you had millions of people suffering what always seemed to me to be the biggest injustice, that they had bought these flats, often flats, in good faith. They had got mortgages on them. They had scraped and saved to do everything that they could, do the thing that government always tells them to do, to get a home of their own, often shared ownership as well, by the way. And yet then were turned around and told that not only were their buildings potentially unsafe in a way that they could never have foreseen, but also they could never sell them.
Yeah. They were absolutely trapped.
Trapped.
Within, I mean, not physically trapped, but trapped economically in a product that was no longer considered sellable.
Yeah, exactly. And the government's response to that over a long period. I mean, there have been lots of reporting on this by lots of other people as well, and there's been loads and loads of campaigns. But it is still a work in progress. And even now, many people are still in a situation where they're awaiting remediation for these building safety problems, which go beyond fire, by the way.
Because we should say that there was, I think it was Michael Gove at the time, wasn't the housing minister, who said there was a fund that he set up. Yes. Wasn't it £100 million fund?
It was more than that, but yeah, it was. But it wasn't nearly enough to cover the actual problems.
Okay, so it covered a tiny fraction of
Well,
those involved?
the problem was there was an element where, in some cases, there probably was an overreaction.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the trouble, isn't it?
Yeah.
That everyone feels unsafe, and then of course all insurance companies are saying, "Well, we don't know about this, so maybe we better not." And then you're stuck in this new trap, whether or not it is truly dangerous.
Exactly right. So you ended up in a situation where banks started to get really skittish over potentially things that were not that problematic. It wasn't as bad. It wasn't about, say, cladding, for example, that was highly flammable. It might be that there wasn't sort of, as I say, proper insulation, or there weren't fire safety walls, or it might be that the balcony was not in the right material. So it was everything from potentially really serious to potentially not so serious. But what Grenfell did is highlight something that everyone in the industry and the government knew, but we all didn't know, the public didn't know, and the banks didn't know, or said that they didn't know, is that there was a real deficiency in the building safety regulations and regime. And that's the point. If suddenly, that's the whole point of having a regulatory regime, right? It's a bit like food. We all go to the supermarket, right? And we eat the food that's in the supermarket.
Because we trust that it's come from the right place.
Exactly, even though we don't actually know the provenance or what's in it or whatever. But
whether
we
it's
trust,
horse.
Yeah, indeed. But we trust, broadly speaking, that the regulatory regime is decent enough that it's going to be safe. Might not always be, but broadly speaking. That was the case, wrongly, about the building regime. But as soon as you lose confidence in it, that's it.
Everything
Confidence
else
drains from everything. And that is what these millions of people have been left with, and it still hasn't been resolved. Well, someone who's experienced this firsthand is Sophie Bishner. And she is a campaigner with the organisation End Our Cladding Scandal. Sophie, thanks so much for being with us today. Are you, I suppose, just your reaction to the report, first of all? Obviously, you weren't directly connected with Grenfell, but in so many ways, the experience of you and so many others have been connected to it deeply. What's your reaction to the report?
It's been a long time coming, and it's a nerve-wracking and, I guess, stressful day for everybody who's been in or has ever been living in a building that is still covered in a flammable cladding. The Grenfell inquiry should be like a landmark case and a landmark report. The government should commit to implementing every single one of the findings. It is really distressing, not only thinking about Grenfell and thinking about what happened, but also thinking about how there hasn't really been any justice to this point, and nobody has been held accountable for what happened on that night. And
just tell us about your own experience in terms of where you live and the sort of how you've got to the point that you're at now.
Yeah, so I also live in a building that has flammable cladding, potentially flammable insulation, and missing fire breaks. We found out around 2019, so a couple of years after the Grenfell Tower disaster, that it was a dangerous building. We've just started the remediation of the building. It's taken obviously 7 years to get to this point. It still has flammable material surrounding it, so in a similar way to the Dagenham building, kind of still at risk. And yeah, it's been a long 7 years. Like, me and hundreds of thousands of other people in the country are still living in these buildings and still having to think about going to sleep at night in a potentially unsafe home.
It's properly sort of economic captivity in that sense, isn't it? You are stuck. Did you ever get to the bottom of whether the company that put the cladding on your building knew whether it was a risky material?
We haven't got that far at all. I think actually we don't really know what the material is. We just know that it's not of a non-combustible material. In
other words, it could be equally dangerous.
Yes, yeah, it could. And in all of these cases, all of the thousands of buildings that are still covered in this material, it isn't just the fact that material is not safe, but it's kind of who put that on, who decided that it should go on buildings, did they know? But then also, how did they get planning permission? How did the building get reviewed? All of these factors still surprise me and surprise anybody that I speak to about the building safety crisis of how has this happened? And I think that's where it kind of goes back to this Grenfell report of it is a complete mix of failure across the board, from successive governments, from developers, from architects. Everybody has been able to cut corners in order to make profit. And it's people like me and horrifically the people that lost their lives that night that have had to suffer.
And Sophie, to be clear, when you talk about £200,000, I mean, this is how I initially got interested in this story when I started hearing about these bills that started landing on people's doormats. This was £200,000 per person, right? And that was not uncommon in terms of the people that you represent. Not uncommon at all. And indeed, some people have faced bankruptcy as a result.
Yeah, it's not uncommon at all. Most people that you speak to that live in a flammable home will see not only costs that come through to take the materials off the building, but also up to kind of 300% increases in insurance costs because you're living in an unsafe building. There's waking watch costs, so the costs of having people patrolling your building at all times of the night to make sure that it doesn't set on fire. There's new sprinklers, there's new fire doors, there's fire door checks every quarter that come, there's building safety reports. So all of these costs just keep coming, and that's kind of outside of that £200,000 of physically removing the materials. It's built up essentially like another level of service charges that have come to leaseholders.
And what is the latest you've heard from the government about all of these? Obviously, you've got the new government now, but the government and the last government in terms of meeting those costs and what they'll pay for.
I think obviously the new government have come in and have agreed to kind of review the situation as it stands at the moment. That is really pressing to us. Like, our homes must be made safe and the people who are responsible should pay. We haven't heard anything more in terms of the costs that come down to leaseholders. There's still a lot of confusion around whether a leaseholder qualifies for government support or whether they don't, and there's kind of lines drawn in the sand there that are really unfair. So End Our Cladding Scandal have been pushing the new government in a similar way to the way that we were with the old government to review these, and now, in light of obviously the Grenfell report as well, adding kind of pressure to this situation. Like, how are we going to make these homes safe now and also make sure that people aren't financially bankrupted by making something that they bought in good faith, not knowing it was unsafe, not knowing how dangerous it was, to be able to put it right.
I mean, suddenly you realise what is coming at this government, right?
Yeah.
It is facing the kind of bills that it cannot even begin to imagine of people like Sophie, who are, nearly 10 years on, billions, still living in absolute sort of fear of what could happen and the cost of what is happening. You've got the survivors of Grenfell, who are absolutely beside themselves with anger, having now had this written down, spoken out loud, that every single one of these deaths was avoidable, and the finger is being pointed at the corporations, at government failure, at corporate greed. And I guess if you're Starmer now, you say, well, is this at the top of the inbox now? Is this, he's spent the whole of PMQs talking about the £22 million black hole. They don't have the money to do the things that they wanted to do before any of this became absolutely, unignorable. So what happens now?
Problem is that whichever way you cut it, and whichever way, however you think about the finances and what should be spent in terms of remediation and so on, there's one thing for which there can be no doubt, which is that whether it's Grenfell for obvious reasons, but also all of hundreds of thousands of people like Sophie who are stuck in these places and whose lives have been, this is the thing that always struck me most when I was covering it, their lives are frozen. They're frozen. Imagine if you think about yourself listening to this.
If you were thinking of having kids and you're still living in a one-bedroom flat that you can't move out of and you can't sell.
So, imagine if you're listening to this and think, well, what house did you buy if you were lucky enough to do so a flat 7 years ago?
Yeah.
And maybe you're still in it, and that's great, but chances are you may have moved on with your life, and that is kind of the whole point of the housing market. These people, it's not just that they're stuck in a house, it's their lives are frozen. What there can be no doubt about for them and for Grenfell is that they have been the victims of a profound injustice. None of these people did anything wrong. There is not even like the slightest sort of hint of culpability. There's no caveat emptor. There's no buyers beware. Like, they bought these in good faith.
You weren't getting knocked down prices at the time.
No,
indeed. Paying top notch
that's
anyway.
the thing. And they're already they're paying
brand
through
new.
them. They're still paying for those mortgages.
Yeah.
They're paying huge amounts often for a property which basically, on some level, they're being told is unlivable and that they cannot sell. So there has been a profound injustice in every single way, and it does have to be addressed one way or the other. The last government tried to do it, didn't get there. One way or the other, this government is going to have to try and look at it.
We'll be back in a second. This has been a painful listen.
Not had the most levity of all the shows we've done.
We thought we all deserved an unashamed handbrake turn. We need to bring you something to go out on to end your dog walk or your run with, which will put a smile on your face.
We never want to depress you.
Not really,
Not
do
ideally,
we? We haven't been very good at that today.
What have we got?
Well,
it's not another job book plug, is it?
Well, I'm sure we've got the offer of a tea and a bun if we need one with Le Sopal. But we've also got the Prime Minister, who's temporarily forgotten that he is in fact the Prime Minister.
So is everyone else.
Listen to PMQs just earlier today.
And having applied the law to the facts and come to a legal conclusion, I don't think the Prime Minister is really inviting me to put that to one side.
The lovely thing is that Keir Starmer does actually speak about himself in the third person quite often.
Apparently,
He goes,
yeah.
What would Keir do?
Yeah.
And so this time
Keir
I don't...
Starmer don't like
Keir
this.
Starmer, but this time he just forgot that he was the Prime Minister and was speaking to Rishi Sunak, who is still, let's not forget, on the front benches opposite.
Well, yeah, maybe it's part. I mean, he's definitely trying to convince us that everything's a Tory's fault. So maybe it's just an extended version of that strategy that actually they're still in government.
I do find the weirdest thing, and I had to ask you, didn't I? I was like, wait, is it still Rishi Sunak? I know I've been away for a week, but a month. But is it still Rishi Sunak?
I know,
because
it is odd.
For the first time, I mean, normally after a disaster, an electoral disaster, heads are gone, heads have rolled and
These
people have
days,
gone
yeah.
and everyone's out. Whereas Rishi Sunak, as we know, is staying put till November. But there is this really weird spectacle of a man who doesn't want to be Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Sitting on the opposition benches asking these questions. And he kept on sort of giving Starmer little outs like, oh, I know you care, or I know that's political, or I know how you feel, or you've explained that. And I thought, oh, actually, it's a totally different Rishi. It's a man who's just kind of going, just let, I get it. It's a hard job. Everyone's having a hard time.
We're still so used to... I mean, I suppose we just got so used to seeing Starmer...
Fighting.
Being in opposition, so it is weird. I mean, even Starmer himself has managed to fall for it. Although there's actually the story about Michael Pitillo used to tell about how when, not long after Major had become Prime Minister, and he saw Thatcher, who had obviously been Prime Minister for 11 and a half years and at the dispatch box for that entire time, he saw Thatcher come into the Commons while he was on the front bench and walk up the gangway, walk up the steps to go to the very back of the Commons. And apparently Major turned to Portillo and said, how do you think the Prime Minister is doing? It becomes so... And Portillo said, oh, Prime Minister, even you have forgotten that she is no longer the Prime Minister. So yeah, it's a bit...
You'd just sit down, wouldn't you? I mean, if you were standing up and she walked into the room.
Yeah.
Also,
they had to stop... Remember, they had to stop when people were doing psychiatric assessments, because they always used to ask that question, who is the Prime Minister? And if they didn't know, that added to the idea. They apparently, even people who were actually mentally unwell remembered that Thatcher was the Prime Minister, so they had to take that off. They had to take that off the question list.
It's
so,
like the Queen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there we go.
Before we go, we should take a call from a little village in Italy, maybe.
Oh yes.
Caller.
No, we must go to our Apulia correspondent.
Our Apulia correspondent.
Yeah. Very important.
Hello, newsagents. I've got a question, which is, why is it that whenever John goes on a well-deserved holiday, Lewis and Emily find it necessary to rip the piss out of him? He seems to me, I've met him a couple of times, a kind of shy and self-effacing guy who probably is just doing this publicity for his book very reluctantly. Anyway, thanks. Look forward to hearing your answers. Giovanni in Puglia.
Okay. Just count with us, dear listeners. Monday, we had the book plug competition offer of a Tina Bun. Tuesday, I think we revisited, didn't we? The book plug. And Wednesday, just to make it a full hat trick, we have had the correspondent calling in from Puglia to remind us of his book.
I think he's the one who needs a psychiatric assessment. He's referring to himself in the third person.
Maybe
I know he's grand, but honestly, yeah, exactly. Well, I can't wait to see how Thursday's attempt to shoehorn his book in goes. What's he going to get?
Don't mention it. Don't mention the name.
Yeah.
It's called A Journey with John Sopel.
Yeah.
Available at all good bookstores now.
Honestly, he's a disgrace.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.